exchange occurs across specialized respiratory surfaces. The process of gas exchange, although this process is often called respiration, it should not be confused with the energy transformations of cellular respiration. Gas exchange is the uptake of molecular oxygen O2 from the environment and the discharge of carbon dioxide CO2 to the environment. These exchanges are necessary to support the production of ATP in cellular respiration and usually involve both the respiratory system and the circulatory system of an animal. The source of O2, called the respiratory medium, is air for terrestrial animals and water for most aquatic animals. The atmosphere is Earth's main reservoir of O2 and is about 21% oxygen by volume. Oceans, lakes, and other bodies of water contain O2 in dissolved form. The amount of O2 dissolved in a given volume of water varies considerably, but is always much less than in an equivalent volume of air. The part of an animal's body where gases are exchanged with the surrounding environment is called the respiratory surface. Animals do not move O2 and CO2 across membranes by active transport, so movement of these gases between the respiratory surface and the environment occurs entirely by diffusion. The rate of diffusion is proportional of the surface area across which diffusion occurs and inversely proportional to the square of the distance through which molecules must move. As a result, respiratory surfaces tend to be thin and have a large surface area, structural adaptations that maximize the rate of gas exchange. Additionally, the living cells must be bathed in water to maintain their plasma membranes. Thus, the respiratory surfaces that terrestrial as well as aquatic animals are moist, and O2 and CO2 diffuse across these surfaces after first dissolving in water. The respiratory surface must supply O2 and expel CO2 for the entire body, and the variety of solutions to the problem of providing a large enough surface have evolved. The structure of a respiratory surface depends mainly on the size of the organism and whether it lives in water or not. But it's also influenced by metabolic demands of gas exchange. Thus, an endotherm generally has a larger area of respiratory surface than a similar sized ectotherm. Gas exchange occurs over the entire surface area of most bursts and other unicellular organisms. Similarly, for some relatively simple animals such as sponges, cnidarians, and flatworms, the plasma membrane of every cell in the body is close enough to the external environment for gases to diffuse in and out. In many animals, however, the bulk of the body does not have direct access of the respiratory medium. The respiratory surface in these animals is a thin, moist epithelium separating the respiratory medium from the blood or capillaries, which transport gases, and from the rest of the body. Some animals use their entire outer skin as a respiratory organ, as earthworm, for example, has moist skin and exchange gases by diffusion across its general body surface. Just below the earthworm's skin is a dense net of capillaries because the respiratory surface must remain moist. Earthworms and many other skin breathers, including most amphibians, must live in water or damp places. Animals whose only respiratory organ is moist skin are usually small and are either long and thin or flat, with a high ratio of surface area to volume. For most other animals, the general body surface lacks sufficient area to exchange gases for the whole body. The solution is a respiratory organ that is extensively folded or branched, thereby enlarging the available surface area for gas exchange. Gills, trachea, and lungs are the three most common respiratory organs. Gills in aquatic animals. Gills are outfoldings of the body surface that are suspended in the water. In some invertebrates, such as sea stars, the gills have a simple shape and are distributed over much of the body, as shown in this figure. Many segmented worms have flap-like gills that extend from each segment of their body, or long fibrous gills clustered at the head or tail. The gills of scallops, crayfish, and many other animals are restricted to a local body region. The total surface area of the gills is often much greater than that of the rest of the body. As a respiratory medium, water has both advantages and disadvantages. There is no problem keeping the plasma membranes of the respiratory surface cells moist since the gills are surrounded by the aqueous environment. However, O2 concentrations in water are low, and the warmer and the saltier the water, the less dissolved O2 it can hold. Water in many marine and freshwater habitats contains only 4 to 8 milliliter of dissolved O2 per liter. Those gels must be very effective for the animal to obtain enough O2. One process that helps the ventilation or increasing the flow of the respiratory medium over the respiratory surface without ventilation or region of low O2 and high CO2 concentration can form around the gel as it exchanges gases with the water. Crayfish and lobsters have pedal-like appendages that drive a current of water over the gills. Fish gills are ventilated by a current of water that enters the mouth, passes through slits in the pharynx, follows over the gills, and then exits the body. As shown in this video, notice that. On the next, also in the next page, notice that because water is dense and contains little O2 pure until the of volume, most fishes must expend considerable energy in ventilating their gills. The arrangement of capillaries in fish gel enhances gas exchange and reduces the energy cost of ventilation. Blood follows the direction opposite to the movement of water past the gills. This makes it possible to transfer O2 to the blood by a very efficient process called countercurrent exchange. As blood moves through a gel capillary, it becomes more and more loaded with O2, but it simultaneously encounters water with ever higher or O2 concentrations because the water is just beginning its passage over the gels. This means that along the entire length of the capillary, there's a diffusion gradient favoring the transfer of O2 from water to blood. The countercurrent of exchange mechanism is so efficient that the gels can remove more than 80% of the oxygen dissolved in the water passing over the respiratory surface. The basic mechanism of countercurrent exchange is also important in temperature regulation. Gels are generally unsuitable for an animal living on land. An expensive surface of wet membrane exposed to air would lose too much water by evaporation, and the gels would collapse as their fine filaments, so longer supported by water, would cling together. Most terrestrial animals house their respiratory surfaces within the body, opening to the atmosphere through narrow tubes. Tracheal systems in insects. As a respiratory medium, air has many advantages over water, including a much higher concentration of oxygen, about 210 milliliter O2 per liter of air. Also, since O2 and CO2 diffuse much faster in air than in water, respiratory surfaces exposed to air do not have to be ventilated as vigorously as gels. As the respiratory surface removes O2 from the air and expels CO2, diffusion rapidly brings more O2 to the respiratory surface and carries the CO2 away. When a terrestrial animal does ventilate, less energy is needed because air is far lighter um, and easier to bomb than water, and because much less volume needs to be breathed to obtain an equal amount of O2. But along with these advantages comes a problem. The respiratory surface, which must be large and moist, continuously loses water to the air by evaporation. The problem is greatly reduced by a respiratory surface folded into the body, while the most familiar such respiratory structure among terrestrial animals is the lung. The most common is the trachea system of insects. The tracheal system of insects, made up of the air tubes that branch through the body, is one variation on the theme of the flooded internal respiratory surface. The largest tubes, called trachea, open to the outside. The finest branches extend to the surface of nearly every cell, where gas is exchanged by diffusion across the moist epithelium that lines the terminal ends of the tracheal system. Notice this closer look. With virtually all body cells within a very short distance of the respiratory medium, the upper circulatory system of insects is not involved in transporting O2 and CO2. For a small insect, diffusion through a trachea brings in enough O2 and removes enough CO2 to support cellular respiration. Larger insects with higher energy demands ventilate their tracheal system with rhythmic body movements that compress and expand the air tubes like bellows. An insect in flight has a very high metabolic rate, consuming 10 to 200 times more O2 than it does at rest. In many flying insects, alternating contraction and relaxation of the flight muscles compress and expand the body rapidly, bombing air through the tracheal system. The flight muscle cells are packed with mitochondria that support the high metabolic rate, and the tracheal tubes supply each of these ATP generating organelles with ample O2. Thus, as shown in this video, those adaptations of tracheal system are directly related to bioenergetics, lungs. Unlike tracheal system that branch through the insect body, lungs are restricted to one location because the respiration surface of a lung is not in direct contact with all other parts of the body. The gap must be bridged by the circulatory system, which transport gases between the lungs and the rest of the body. Lungs have a dense net of capillaries just under the epithelium that forms the respiratory surface. Lungs have evolved spiders, terrestrial snails, and vertebrates. Among the vertebrates, amphibians have relatively small lungs that do not provide a very large surface. Many lack lungs altogether, relying heavily on diffusion across other body surfaces for gas exchange. The skin of a frog, for example, supplements gas exchange in the lungs. In contrast, most reptiles, including all bears and all mammals, rely entirely on lungs for gas exchange. Titles are an exception. They supplement lung breathing with gas exchange across moist epithelial surfaces in their mouth and anus. Lungs and air breathing have evolved in a few aquatic vertebrates, lungfishes, as adaptations to living in oxygen poor water or to spending part of their time exposed to air. For instance, when the water level of a pond recedes. In general, the size and complexity of lungs are correlated with an animal's metabolic rate and hence its rate of gas exchange. For example, the lungs of Endotherm have a greater area of exchange surface than those of similar sized ectotherms.